In the late summer of 1992, in a quiet mountain town in western Montana, a young married couple drove up to a lodge for their honeymoon and never came back down. Their room was untouched. Their car was still in the gravel lot, locked, keys gone. A trusted handyman from the lodge vanished the same night. Police searched for 11 weeks and found nothing. No blood, no bodies, no answers. The case quickly went cold. 3 names went onto a brass plate at the trailhead, and a town learned to grieve all 3 the same way. 24 years later, one small detail in a forgotten photograph reopened the case and revealed a truth no one was prepared for. Because one of the names on that plate did not belong there. If stories like this matter to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it costs you nothing. Now, let's get into today's case. Tamarack Bend, Montana, sits in a fold of the Sawtell Range where 2 creeks meet and the highway gives up trying to be straight. In 1992, it had 1 grocery, 1 pharmacy with a lunch counter, 2 churches that disagreed politely, and a population that shrank every winter and swelled every summer when the Forest Service hired seasonals. Eleanor Whitcomb had lived there her entire life. She was 54 that summer, a school bus driver with 40 years of other people's children in her rearview mirror, and she was the kind of woman who kept butterscotch candies in her coat pocket for no reason she could explain. She hummed hymns off-key while she worked. She would not sit with her back to a door. Her husband, Ray, called it superstition. She called it good sense. Eleanor had 1 son. Danny Whitcomb was 26 years old that August, 6'1", freckled across the shoulders. With sun-bleached hair, he cut himself with clippers in the bathroom mirror and always got crooked in back. He'd worked Forest Service trail crew for 6 seasons, swinging a Pulaski, clearing blowdown, hauling rock in a bucket up switchbacks in 90-degree heat. In the winters, he fixed small engines in his father's garage. Chainsaws, snowblowers, outboard motors. He could listen to a 2-stroke for 8 seconds and tell you what was wrong with it. He whistled through his teeth constantly, a tuneless sound that drove his father half insane. He carried a tube of lip balm in his shirt pocket every single day of his adult life, and Eleanor never once saw him use it. And from the time he could talk until the last time she saw him, he called his mother Ellie Bird. She used to tell people that her son had never in his life walked past a person who needed help. It sounded like the kind of thing a mother says. It happened to be true. He'd changed tires for strangers in sleet. He'd carried an old man's groceries 11 blocks. In 1990, he pulled a 9-year-old out of the Sawtell River below the county bridge and then apologized to the boy's mother for losing his boots. In the spring of 1991, at a pancake breakfast in the Lutheran church basement, Danny Whitcomb met Marisol Kessler. Everybody called her Mari. She was 24, small and dark-haired, with a permanent sunburn across the bridge of her nose and a laugh that came out sounding like a hiccup, which embarrassed her, which made her laugh harder. She taught music at the elementary school 30 second graders and a plastic recorder each, which she described as an act of war against the human ear. She kept a life list of birds in a spiral notebook held together with masking tape. 211 species. She could imitate a varied thrush so well that the actual birds answered her. Danny thought this was the most remarkable thing he had ever witnessed and told her so on the first night in a church basement over a paper plate of pancakes. They were married on July 18, 1992, in a field behind the Kessler house under a rented white tent that leaked. It rained for 11 minutes during the vows and then stopped, and everyone said it was good luck. Mari's mother, Rosalind Kessler, ran the pharmacy counter in town, and had a spine like rebar. She was 52, sharp-tongued, and she did not like Danny Whitcomb, not for any reason she could name. He was a seasonal. He had no degree. He had a temper he'd shown exactly twice in public, both times at men who deserved it, and Rosalind had catalogued both. There had been a bad conversation the week of the wedding. Rosalind had said something about a girl with a teaching certificate marrying a man with a chainsaw. And Eleanor had said something back that she never repeated to anyone. Ever. And the two mothers had not spoken since not at the reception, not in the receiving line, not in the pharmacy aisle when they passed each other 3 days later. They would not speak again for 24 years. For the honeymoon, the couple booked 6 nights at Camas Ridge Lodge, a hand-built concession lodge, 18 miles up a Forest Service road. 10 rooms, a wood stove in the lobby, elk antlers over the door. No phones in the rooms. One payphone by the ice machine. It was the kind of place where the staff scattered every autumn like seeds, and nobody kept track of where they went. Mari wanted it for the birds. Danny wanted it because she wanted it. They left Tamarack Bend on the morning of August 30th, 1992, in Danny's tan 1984 Ford Bronco, with a cooler, a tent, 2 sleeping bags, Mari's spiral notebook, and a brand new camera Rosalind had given them as a wedding gift. Eleanor stood in her driveway and watched them go. 24 years later, she could still describe the exact angle of the sun. The lodge staff loved them immediately. Newlyweds are good for business and good for morale, and this pair was easy to love. She in a red windbreaker, he sunburned and grinning, both of them entirely uninterested in anyone else in the room. They hiked every day. Mari added a 3-toed woodpecker to her life list on September 1st and wrote it in her notebook in blue ink with 3 exclamation points. There's a guest register from that week that survived. And it survived because the lodge burned in 2003 and somebody had already carried the old registers down to the Historical Society in a milk crate. Danny signed them in on August 30th in his big looping hand. D&M Whitcomb, Tamarack Bend. And in the comments column, where guests usually wrote nothing, he wrote, "Married 6 weeks. She's out of my league. Don't tell her." The cook, a woman named Bernadette Ives, remembered them clearly enough 13 years later to give a statement about it. She said the girl came into the kitchen the second morning and asked if there was any way to get a thermos of coffee at 4 a.m. because they were going to try for owls. She said the boy stood in the doorway the whole time with his hands in his pockets, grinning like an idiot. She said she gave them the thermos and told them to keep it. That thermos was never found. Neither was Mari's binoculars, or the camera Rosalind gave them, or the spiral notebook's second half. They swam in Camas Lake on August 31st, in water cold enough to make your bones ache, and a family from Spokane saw them do it and laughed at them from the dock. They ate dinner at the long table in the lobby every night with strangers and were, by every account, the most obviously happy people in the building. 6 days. That's what they got. And there was a man at the lodge who took a shine to them. Everybody called him Uncle Wen. Wendell Arliss was 44 years old, a packer and handyman who drifted into Tamarack Bend in the fall of 1988 and simply never left. He was thick through the chest, quiet, gray at the temples, missing the last 2 fingers of his left hand. A saw accident, he said years back, another state. He fixed water heaters for widows and refused payment. He plowed the church lot for free every winter. He knew every trail in the Sawtells by heart and drew maps for guests on paper napkins freehand, and they were always right. Everybody in that town would have told you that Wendell Arliss was the best man they knew. He offered to take the Newlyweds up to Cutthroat Saddle for a sunrise. It was a long drive, he said, all the way around the divide, and you had to leave at 3 in the morning. But the birds up there at first light were something you didn't forget. Mari said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Now here is where a story like this always turns. And here is where you should pay attention. Because when the anchor of this story, Eleanor Whitcomb, was later asked whether anything had felt wrong that week, she said no. Nothing. Not one thing. That was the whole horror of it. There was one small detail, though. There always is. On the evening of September 1st, Marie called her mother from the payphone by the ice machine. It was a short call, 6 or 7 minutes, mostly about the weather and nesting osprey. And near the end of it, Marie said something offhand that Rosalind Kessler would replay in her head every night for the next 2 decades. She said, "There's a man here who's really nice to us. Danny says he's too nice." Rosalind laughed and said something about small towns. Marie laughed her hiccup laugh and said goodbye and hung up. That was the last time anyone in Tamarack Bend spoke to either of them. The morning of September 2nd, 1992, was cold enough at elevation to bead the windows. At 7:40 a.m., a housekeeper named Delphine Roy let herself into room 6 with her cart and stopped in the doorway. The bed was made not by staff, by hand, badly, the way people make a bed when they're in a hurry and were raised right. 2 coffee cups sat on the dresser, both used, both cold. Marie's spiral notebook lay open on the nightstand next to a pair of drugstore reading glasses. Her red windbreaker hung on the back of the chair. The last entry in the notebook was dated the previous evening. It read, September 1st. Clark's Nutcracker, 4 birds, camp robber behavior, D. Fed one from his hand. Underneath, in the margin, she'd drawn a small bird. 3 lines, the way you doodle when you're happy and half asleep. Their toothbrushes were in the cup. Her earrings were on the windowsill. His wallet was in the drawer with $41 in it. Outside in the gravel lot, the tan Bronco was parked exactly where they'd left it on the day they arrived. Nose out, locked, cold. The keys were gone. And the third room down the hall, the little staff room behind the boiler closet where Wendell Arliss slept, was empty too. Bed stripped. Duffel gone. A coffee can of screws left on the sill. Wendell's truck, a green Chevy flatbed with a homemade toolbox, was also gone. By noon, the lodge manager had called the sheriff. By 2, the sheriff had called the Forest Service. By 4, there were 40 people on that mountain, shouting 3 names into the trees. They found nothing. No tire tracks that meant anything on a road that 30 vehicles used a day. No blood, no struggle, no note. Nothing disturbed, nothing broken, nothing taken except 3 people and a truck. 3 human beings had vanished without a trace, and they had done it in a place with 1 road in and 1 road out. Something felt wrong, really wrong. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. The man who caught the case was Detective Reuben Ostrand, 49, 3 years from a pension, a heavy smoker with a bad knee and a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose when he was thinking, which by October of 1992 was constantly. He did everything right. That's the part that would eat him alive later. He brought in K-9 teams out of Missoula. The dogs took the couple's scent from the lodge, worked the parking lot, worked the trailhead, and lost it in the gravel, which meant vehicle. He had the Bronco processed. Nothing. He pulled Danny's fingerprints from the garage back home to compare against Layton's nobody ever found. He had divers in Camas Lake for 6 days. He had the Forest Service fly grids until the money ran out. He interviewed 112 people. And every single one of them, without exception, said the same three things. The couple were happy. Wendell Arliss was a saint. And somebody must have come up that road who didn't belong. There was one clue. There is always one clue. At 4:15 in the morning on September 2nd, a log truck driver named Herb Vance passed a green flatbed Chevy going the other way, 41 miles from the lodge, on the far side of the divide, headed east on the Buckhorn Road. He remembered it because he flashed his lights, and the other driver didn't flash back, which up there was a small rudeness worth remembering. He said there were 3 people in the cab. He was sure of 3. He said the middle one had long hair. That sighting was the only physical thread Ostrand ever held. And it made no sense at all because the Buckhorn Road went nowhere. It ran 40 miles up a drainage into burnt country and dead-ended at a closed gate. There was no reason on earth for 3 people from Camas Ridge to be on it at 4 in the morning. They searched the Buckhorn drainage twice. The second time, in October, snow shut them down. Then, slowly, the theory started to change. It changed the way theories change in small towns, not in a meeting, but in a hardware store, at a kitchen table, in a church parking lot. People started remembering things about Danny Whitcomb. The time he'd shoved a man outside the Elks, the temper, the chainsaw, the girl with the teaching certificate. It started with the truck. If Danny and Marie and Wendell had all been taken by an outsider, where was the green Chevy flatbed? A stranger doesn't need a 1979 farm truck with a homemade toolbox, but a man running does. Then it was the log driver's sighting. 3 in the cab. Not 4, not 2, 3, which meant nobody was tied up in a bed and nobody was in a trunk, which meant everyone in that truck got in on their own feet. And people started asking, in kitchens, at the hardware counter, who gets in a truck at 4 in the morning with a man who's about to kill them? Nobody in that town could make that sentence end with Uncle Wen. So they made it end with the other one. By spring of 1993, half of Tamarack Bend believed that Danny Whitcomb had killed his wife and Wendell Arliss, taken the truck and run. It got ugly the way small town things get ugly quietly, and in the ordinary places. Somebody spray-painted the door of Ray Whitcomb's garage in June of 1993, and Ray repainted the whole building rather than have his wife see it. Eleanor's bus route was reassigned that fall, and nobody told her why, and she never asked because she already knew. There was one man who never went along with it. Detective Ostrand kept working it quietly, on his own time, for 4 more years. He ran Danny's name against every hospital, every arrest, every death certificate, every set of unidentified remains in 11 western states, 94 times. He got nothing every single time. In 1996, he drove to Elko County, Nevada, on a hunch about the truck because a green Chevy flatbed, matching the description, had been sold at a lot outside Wells in October of 1992 by a man who paid cash and gave a name that came back to nothing. He couldn't tie it to anybody. He came home. He put it in the file on a single typed page, and it sat in that file, correct, for 20 years. Ostrand told his wife once in 1997 that he thought the husband had done it. Then he retired. He said later that he was tired, and that when you're tired, you take the story that fits, and that taking the story that fits is how a man ends up wrong for 2 decades. By 1995, it was in the newspaper as a leading theory. Rosalind Kessler believed it until the day the truth came out. So did Detective Ostrand. He never said so publicly. He said so exactly once to his own wife in 1997. And then he retired. The case quickly went cold. And when it went cold, it left one family with a grave to visit and the other family with a name to carry. 24 years is not a montage. It is 8,760 mornings. Ray Whitcomb, Danny's father, kept working the garage for 9 years with his son's coveralls still hanging on the nail by the door. He wouldn't let Eleanor wash them. In 2001, he sat down in the kitchen to take off his boots and didn't get back up. Cardiac arrest, the doctor said. Eleanor never used that word. She said her husband died of it being the thing that had been eating him since 1992, unnamed, in the chair by the window. Eleanor kept driving the school bus until 2004. Children she'd driven had children of their own by then. Some of those children had heard the story. She could tell which ones by the way they looked at her when they climbed the steps. She kept his room. Not as a shrine, she was too practical for that, but she never got around to it. Year after year, and then it had been long enough that getting around to it would have meant something. The coveralls stayed on the nail in the garage until she sold the garage in 2009. And then they came into the house and hung in the hall closet. Every year on July 18th, she made the same lemon cake she'd made for the wedding. And every year, she threw most of it away. Rosalind Kessler, 2 miles across town, did it differently. She got angry and stayed angry because anger is load-bearing and grief isn't. She kept Marie's recorder and her spiral notebook and the masking tape. And she gave interviews in 1997 and 2002 and 2009 in which she said out loud, on the record, that she believed her son-in-law had murdered her daughter and was living somewhere under another name. Eleanor read every one of them. She never responded. Not once. She told her sister that responding would have made it a fight between two mothers. And there was only ever one thing wrong in this world, and it wasn't Rosalind Kessler. In 2011, the case was reviewed by a state cold case unit for 6 weeks and closed again. The reviewing detective's summary is 2 paragraphs long. It says the most likely scenario is a domestic homicide followed by flight, and it recommends no further investigative action at this time. Eleanor Whitcomb has a copy of that page. She keeps it in a kitchen drawer with the takeout menus. She said she keeps it because someday somebody was going to have to write a different one. In town, they built the memorial in 1994. 3 river stones set in concrete at the Camas Ridge trailhead, with a single brass plate. Marisol Kessler Whitcomb Daniel Whitcomb Wendell Arliss, taken from us, September 2nd, 1992. The Kessler family paid for the plate. The Arliss stone was the one people left flowers on most, because Wendell had no family at all. And Tamarack Bend was not going to let a man with no family go unmourned. Eleanor Whitcomb went up there twice a year for 24 years. And every time she cleaned all 3 stones, including his. She'd kneel on a folded towel in the dirt with a rag and a jug of water and scrub the moss out of the lettering of a man's name. And then she'd sit back on her heels and say, out loud, to a mountain, "You looked after them, Gwen. I know you tried. Remember that. It matters more than anything else in this story." Rosalind Kessler went up on Marie's birthday every March. The 2 women arranged their visits, silently, over decades, so that they would never once meet. And every year the plate got a little greener, and the road got a little worse, and the people who remembered got a little fewer. And that is how a case dies. Not in a courtroom, in a slow forgetting. Then in 2016, everything suddenly changed. It started 900 miles away, in a garage in Boise, Idaho, with a man who had never heard of Tamarack Bend, Montana. Curtis Pham was 34, an insurance adjuster with an expensive hobby. He bought old cameras at estate sales, cleaned them up, and shot with them. Occasionally, one came with film still inside. He developed those himself. It was, he said, like opening someone's mail from the past. In February of 2016, he bought a cardboard box at an estate sale in Nampa for $11. 3 cameras, a broken flash, and a pill bottle full of loose 35mm canisters, exposed, undeveloped. The estate belonged to a man named Terrell Boyce, who had died in 2014 at the age of 41. Terrell had been 19 years old in 1992, working as a seasonal sawyer on Forest Service fire crews. His mother had kept his old things in a footlocker, and then she had died too. And it all went out on folding tables in a driveway on a Saturday morning. Curtis Pham developed the roles in March. Most were nothing: a dog, a car, a grill, a girlfriend. One role was different. It was a fire camp. Canvas wall tents in a meadow, a chow line, exhausted young men sitting on the ground with their boots off, a helicopter on a bare knob with rotor blades drooping, smoke haze turning the sun into a coin. It was, Curtis thought, a really beautiful set of pictures, the kind of accidental documentary photography that nobody knows they're making. He posted 28 scans to an online forum for found and orphaned film, with the caption, "Undeveloped roll from 1992-ish, estate sale, some kind of wildfire camp. Anyone recognize it?" He posted it and forgot about it. 9 days later, a retired Forest Service dispatcher in Colorado replied with the fire name the Buckhorn Complex, Sawtell Range, Montana, September 1992, and a spike camp designation, Camp 4, Ptarmigan Meadows. 2 hours after that, someone else replied with 3 words that changed everything. Frame 19. Zoom in. Frame 19 was not a photograph of the newlyweds. That's important. Nobody had photographed them on purpose. Frame 19 was a picture of a chow line. 11 firefighters in dirty yellows queued up beside a canvas tent with paper plates in their hands. Terrell Boyce had been photographing his friends. At the far right edge of the frame, 40 feet behind the line, 2 civilians stood at the meadow's edge in daylight. A young woman in a red windbreaker, hair pulled back, laughing with her head tipped forward. A tall young man beside her, sunburned, hair crookedly cut in back, holding a paper cup. The forum user who found them had done what people do now: reverse searched an old missing persons flyer that had been scanned into a volunteer database in 2009 and sat there, untouched, for 7 years. The flyer had 2 photographs on it. One was Danny and Marie's wedding portrait from July 18, 1992. It was them. The Whitcombs were at that fire camp. Eleanor Whitcomb learned about it on a Tuesday afternoon in April from a reporter at the County Weekly who called her landline and said, "Utaz, ma'am, I need to ask you to sit down." She did not sit down. She stood in her kitchen with the receiver in her hand and listened to a stranger explain that there was a photograph of her son alive. And she asked him one question. "What day?" There was a pause on the line. "September 8th, the reporter said. "Ma'am, 6 days after they disappeared, and it's 40 miles east of the lodge." Eleanor Whitcomb's blood ran cold. Because for 24 years, every version of every theory, the good ones and the vicious ones, had started at the same place. Whatever happened on the night of September 2nd at Camas Ridge. It hadn't. Her son was alive on September 8th in daylight, 40 miles away, drinking coffee at a fire camp, laughing next to his wife. And every single map, every grid, every dive team, every dog, all of it, had been pointed at the wrong end of the mountain range for 24 years. Here is where this story stops being about a photograph of two people and starts being about everything standing behind them. Detective Ruben Ostrand was 73 years old and living in a fifth wheel outside Deer Lodge. When they brought him the scans, he laid them out on a folding table, put on his glasses, and looked for a long time at the two figures at the edge of the frame. Then he did something nobody expected. He pushed them aside and asked for the other 27. "They're the ones everybody's looking at," he said. "So they're the ones that'll tell us least. I want the background." That single instinct is the reason this case was solved. Because the background of those photographs was a machine for telling time. A wildland fire spike camp is one of the most precisely dated objects that can ever appear in a photograph. It exists for days, not seasons. Camp 4 at Ptarmigan Meadows was established on September 3, 1992, and demobilized on September 11, 1992. 9 days. Every tent in that meadow, every generator, every water buffalo, every plastic chair existed there for 9 days in the entire history of the world. And the frames could be dated inside that window individually. A cartographer named Junie Alcott, 61, retired, a volunteer with an online terrain matching group that normally identified locations in old vacation slides, took the whole roll and started measuring. She matched the ridgeline behind the meadow to a 1 to 24,000 quad and found the camera's position to within about 15 meters. She used the snow patch on the north face of Ptarmigan Peak, which shrank measurably between frames. She used the fireweed at the meadow edge gone to seed in some frames, cotton blown out in others. She used a hand-lettered trail closure sign whose wording changed midway through the roll because the closure was expanded on September 6th. And she used the shadows. Sun angle, azimuth, a known latitude, and a known elevation. She could put frames within about 40 minutes of a clock time. Frame 19, the Newlyweds in the Chow line, was taken on the afternoon of September 8, 1992, between 4:20 and 5 p.m., 6 days after they vanished without a trace. The couple were not being held. That was the strangest part. In frame 19, they are laughing. In frame 22, they are sitting on a log with paper plates. In frame 24, Maurice is looking up at the sky with binoculars, and Danny is watching her look the way he always did. They were stranded, not captive, waiting for something. Which raised the only question that mattered. Who brought them there? And why did nobody at that fire camp ever come forward? Junie Alcott found him in frame 22. She had been working the edges. She always worked the edges, and there was a man at the tree line about 80 feet behind the Newlyweds, partly cut off by the frame, in a hard hat and yellow shirt, half turned away. You could not see his face. You could see his left hand. It was resting on the head of a Pulaski, the axe and hoe tool every fire crew carries, with the handle standing upright against his hip. The hand had 3 fingers. Junie Alcott sat back in her chair in her kitchen in Bozeman at 11 at night and said out loud, to nobody, "Oh my God." She called the sheriff's office in Tamarack Bend the next morning. Then she called Ostrand. Then she scanned the frame at the highest resolution she could manage and sent it to Eleanor Whitcomb. Because Eleanor had asked her to send everything, always, no matter what. Eleanor opened the file on a laptop her neighbor had set up for her. She enlarged the image until it went to grain. She looked at that hand for a long, long time. Every winter for 4 years, that hand had shoveled her walk. That hand had rebuilt her water heater in 1990 and refused a dime for it. That hand had shaken her son's hand at the wedding on July 18, 1992. Under a tent that leaked. And on September 8, 1992, 6 days after Wendell Arliss was supposed to have vanished. 40 miles from where he was supposed to have vanished, that hand was resting on a fire tool, 80 feet behind her son, in a place nobody knew any of them had ever been. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Unless it did. Unless it had always made sense, and everyone had simply been looking at the wrong 3 names. Nobody official moved on that hand for 5 weeks. That is not a criticism of anyone. A blurry hand at the edge of a 24-year-old photograph is not probable cause. The sheriff's office had 2 detectives and a meth problem. The county attorney wanted something a jury could hold. Eleanor Whitcomb did not have 5 weeks in her, and she knew it. She was 78. Her knees were finished. She had watched Ray die waiting for somebody to do something. So she did it herself, badly and stubbornly, from a kitchen table. She got the fire's name from Junie Alcott, and she started calling firefighters, not through any agency, found through a reunion association for retired Forest Service seasonals that had a newsletter and a mailing list. And a woman in Coeur d'Alene who agreed to print Eleanor's letter in it because Eleanor called her 4 times. The letter was 1 page. It had frame 19 on it, and it asked 1 question. Were you at Camp 4, Ptarmigan Meadows, in September 1992? Do you remember a young couple who were not on the crew? She sent 206 of them. With stamps she bought 40 at a time, and she wrote every envelope by hand. She got 19 replies. 11 were condolences. 5 were people who'd been on the Buckhorn complex, but not at Camp 4. 2 were no help at all. 1 was from a man in Lewiston, Idaho, named Odell Frayne, who had been 22 years old in 1992 and had cooked at that spike camp, and who wrote 3 sentences that Eleanor Whitcomb read, standing up in her driveway with the mailbox still open. I remember them. We all thought they were somebody's kids waiting on a ride. There was an older guy with a bad hand looking after them, and we figured he was the dad. She sat down on her front step in the rain with the letter in both hands, and she did not go inside for a long time. Because she had it now, not proof, but a living human being who had seen her son alive on a mountain 40 miles from where the world had spent 24 years looking for him. Standing next to a man everybody in Tamarack Bend had grieved. She drove that letter to the sheriff's office herself, in the rain, at 78 years old. And she put it on the desk, and she said, "Now will somebody go look at the paperwork?" They went and looked at the paperwork. The final piece did not come from a lab. It came from a filing cabinet in a garage in Kalispell. Arlene Sowerby was 81 years old and had been a fire camp timekeeper for 22 seasons. Timekeepers track casual hires. The temporary workers a big fire pulls in off the street when it runs short of bodies. In 1992, that paperwork was carbon copy triplicate. White to the agency, yellow to the finance section, pink stays in the book. Arlene Sowerby had kept every pink copy of her entire career. Not for any reason. She just never threw things away. She had the Buckhorn complex, September 1992, Camp 4. 31 casual hires. Names, dates, hours, signatures. One of them had signed on the afternoon of September 3rd, 1992, the day the camp opened, as a general laborer at the AD3 rate. The name on the line was W.R. Cobb. The signature underneath it was a slow, careful, cramped hand, the handwriting of a man who has to concentrate to write, because he is doing it with a hand that is missing 2 fingers. He worked 9 days. He signed out on September 11th, 1992, when Camp 4 demobilized. He collected $288 in cash at the D-Mob station. And then W.R. Cobb walked out of Ptarmigan Meadows and did not exist anywhere on paper again. The man everyone in Tamarack Bend had mourned for 24 years had spent the week of the disappearance drawing a government paycheck under another name, 40 miles away, with the missing Newlyweds standing in a meadow behind him. Detective Reuben Ostrand read that timesheet in a sheriff's conference room in May of 2016. He was 73 years old. He put it down, took his glasses off, and put both hands flat on the table. Then he said the sentence that broke a town in half. There were never 3 victims. There were 2 victims and a man who needed a place to hide. 24 hours later, it got worse, and then it got frightening. Because the story had gone public, the photograph had been in the county weekly, then the Missoulian, then a Spokane television station picked it up with the 3-fingered hand circled in red on the screen. Somewhere out there, a man watched that broadcast. On May 19th, 2016, in a town called Dunmore, Oregon, population 4,000, a mill town going soft at the edges, a 78-year-old retired mill hand named Wendell Cobb listed his pickup for sale in the classifieds at $800 under value, cash only. On May 20th, he burned a barrel of paper behind his shed. A neighbor noticed because it was a burn ban week. On May 21st, he withdrew $4,300, which was every cent he had. He had lived in Dunmore for 23 years. He fixed water heaters for widows. He plowed the church lot in the winter and would not take payment. His neighbors thought he was the best man they knew. He had done it once. He was doing it again. And a woman named Eleanor Whitcomb, 78 years old, sat in her kitchen in Tamarack Bend, Montana, and understood before the FBI understood it, before Ostrand said it out loud, exactly what was about to happen. He was going to vanish again. And this time, there would be nobody left alive who remembered his face. They did not have enough to arrest him. That is the hard, unglamorous truth of it. A photograph of a 3-fingered hand and a timesheet with a false name is a story, not a case. A defense attorney would have it apart in an afternoon. And there was a second problem, so strange that the county attorney had to read the statute 3 times. Wendell Arliss had been declared legally dead in 1999. The state of Montana had signed a piece of paper saying that the man did not exist. You cannot charge a dead man. You cannot arraign a death certificate. Before anything else could happen, a judge would have to formally undo a death, vacate a declaration the state itself had issued 17 years earlier. And that is not a thing that happens in an afternoon either. So while lawyers argued about whether a man was alive, everyone else went to the mountain. Junie Alcott had the camera position. From there, she had the meadow, the camp layout, the road spur, and the D-Mob route, the single track a vehicle had to take out of Ptarmigan Meadows on September 11th, 1992. 2 miles down that spur, the road crossed under a talus slope below a formation the old maps called Coffin Rock. In 1992, 3 weeks after the camp closed, a section of that slope had let go in the first hard freeze and slid across the road. The Forest Service closed the spur permanently rather than pay to clear it. It's in a maintenance log. Nobody thought twice about it for 24 years. On June 6, 2016, a state search and recovery team with a track hoe and 11 volunteers began pulling rock off a road that had been buried since the autumn Danny and Marie disappeared. On the 3rd day, at a depth of just under 2 meters, they reached the old road surface. Eleanor Whitcomb was not allowed at the site. She sat in a folding chair in the gravel lot at the bottom of the spur, 7 hours a day, for 4 days, with a thermos and a folded towel in her lap. because she'd brought the towel out of habit, the way she brought it every time she went to clean 3 stones. On the afternoon of June 9th, a sheriff's deputy walked down the spur toward her, and she watched him come the whole way, and she knew from about 200 yards out. They had found them, both of them, together, under the rock. What the recovery established over 11 weeks was more damning than any confession, and it was established before anyone ever spoke to the man in Oregon. That mattered enormously later in court. There were 2 sets of remains. Dental records identified them within a week. Marisol Kessler Whitcomb, 24, Daniel Whitcomb, 26. They had not been buried. They had been left on the road surface and covered by a slope that came down naturally 3 weeks afterward. The killer never buried them. He never had to. He knew that country, and he knew what a freeze does to talus, and he simply left them where the mountain would take care of it. Both had died of blunt force injuries to the head. And in the debris beneath the rock, the recovery team found a fire tool. A Pulaski, standard Forest Service issue, 1980s pattern. The head sheared clean off the handle by the weight of the slide. The cutting edge of that head had a distinctive fracture, a chipped corner where a triangular piece had broken out of the steel. The kind of damage a tool gets when a crewman hits a buried rock and keeps working anyway. A fragment of steel was recovered from one of the skull injuries. Metallurgical comparison matched it to the fracture surface on that Pulaski head. Not consistent with. Matched a physical fit, edge to edge, the way a torn page matches the piece it came from. That established the weapon. It did not establish the man. The man was established by the handle. The wooden handle had survived under the rock, split but whole. And 19 inches down from the head, someone had repaired a crack the old way, with a hand-cut wedge of a different wood driven in crossways and shaved flush, an idiosyncratic, obsolete, entirely personal repair. Done by hand, by somebody who had learned it from somebody else a long time before. Junie Alcott went back to frame 22. She enlarged the Pulaski standing upright against the hip of the 3-fingered man at the tree line, 80 feet behind Danny and Maury Whitcomb on the afternoon of September 8, 1992. 19 inches down from the head, on a handle photographed by a 19-year-old Sawyer who died in 2014 without ever knowing what he'd taken a picture of. There is a pale cross-grain wedge, shaved flush. 2 independent objects, one buried under rock for 24 years, one preserved on film in a pill bottle in a cardboard box at an estate sale. The same tool. That is what physical evidence looks like when it does not need anybody to say a word. On July 28, 2016, a Montana district judge vacated the 1999 declaration of death of Wendell Arliss in the strangest hearing that courtroom had ever hosted. The order runs 4 pages. In effect, it says, "The state was wrong. This man is alive, and the law now recognizes him again for the sole purpose of holding him responsible." The following morning, FBI agents and Oregon State Police took him at a bus station in Dunmore, Oregon, with a canvas duffel between his boots and a ticket to Reno in his shirt pocket. He was 9 minutes from boarding. He was 78 years old. He did not run. He did not argue. He looked at the badge, and then he looked past all of them at the parking lot. And he said one thing. "Took you long enough." His fingerprints were run, and the last piece of the story fell out of a filing cabinet in Nevada. His name was not Wendell Arliss. It had never been Wendell Arliss. He was born Dale Prosser in 1938, and in November of 1988, in Elko County, Nevada, a woman named Bernice Otley had been beaten to death in the trailer she rented from him. There had been no arrest. There had been a print on a jar lid that nobody could match, because in 1988, nobody could match anything without a name to compare it to. There had been a landlord who left town 2 weeks later and was never located. He had driven north until the road ran out and become Wendell Arliss in a town of 1,100 people. And he had been very, very good at it for 4 years. The full account came at sentencing in March of 2017 in a courtroom in Deer Lodge with Eleanor Whitcomb in the second row and Rosalind Kessler beside her. He had pled guilty, 2 counts of deliberate homicide. His lawyer had advised him against speaking. He spoke anyway, for 18 minutes, reading from a legal pad in that slow, cramped, 3-fingered hand. And what he said reframed the entire 24 years for every person in that room. In August of 1992, a Nevada detective had written a letter to the Sawtell County Sheriff. It was a routine letter, a long-shot letter, the kind investigators send by the dozen, asking about a former Elko landlord who might be living in the area under the name Arliss. Wendell Arliss had seen that letter. Not because anyone showed it to him. Because he did odd jobs at the courthouse, and because he had spent 4 years being the most helpful man in town. And being the most helpful man in town gets you into every building. He had perhaps 3 weeks. And here is the part that made a courtroom go silent. He said he knew, from Nevada, that a man who simply disappears gets hunted. A man who disappears alone becomes a suspect on the day he's missed. Bulletins go out. Photographs circulate. Somebody, somewhere, eventually looks twice. But a man who disappears alongside other people, a man who vanishes in the middle of a tragedy, with a young bride and a well-liked local boy, that man doesn't get hunted. That man gets mourned. He needed a disappearance big enough to hide his own inside. So he chose them, not out of hatred, not out of desire. He chose them because they were newlyweds and photogenic and beloved, and because a case with a pretty young couple in it would pull every resource in the county to the wrong mountain and keep it there, and because nobody on earth looks for a body at a candlelight vigil. He drove them out on the Buckhorn Road at 3 a.m. on September 2nd for a sunrise that was never going to happen. He told them the truck's water pump had gone. He told them the spur was washed out, and there'd be a Forest Service rig through in a day or 2. He kept them 9 days in a canvas tent at the edge of a fire camp full of exhausted 20-year-olds who assumed they were somebody's family, while he drew a government paycheck under a dead man's name and waited for the camp to break. They were not restrained. They had no reason to be. They thought they were stuck. They thought a kind man was taking care of them. He said Mari kept a bird list the whole time. He said she added a black-backed woodpecker on the 6th day and was thrilled about it because it's a burn specialist, and there was a burn. On the morning of September 11th, 1992, Camp 4 demobilized, and he told them he had a ride arranged down the spur. He said the young man knew. Danny Whitcomb figured it out somewhere on that road from the direction they were driving, or the demob traffic they weren't following, or something in a face. And a quarter-mile above Coffin Rock, Danny told his wife to get out and run down the drainage, and he stayed. He stayed on that road with nothing in his hands, 26 years old. And he put himself between his wife and a man with a fire tool, and he bought her about 400 yards. She came back. That was the sentence that broke the courtroom. Prosser said it flatly, without any understanding of what he was saying. She came back for him. I don't know why. She was clear. They were found together under the rock because that is where they were on the last day of their lives. Mari Whitcomb, having run 400 yards to safety, turned around and come back up the road for her husband. For 24 years, this was a story about a man who abandoned his wife. It was always a story about 2 people who refused to leave each other. Dale Prosser was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. He was 78 years old. Elko County filed on the 1988 homicide of Bernice Otley 2 months later. And her family, who had waited 28 years, finally got a name. Eleanor Whitcomb was allowed to give a statement. She was 78. She stood up with a piece of notebook paper folded in quarters and did not use it. She talked for 4 minutes. She said that her son had been a good man and that goodness had cost him his life, and that she was not going to apologize for him being the kind of person who steps in front of somebody. She said she'd been told for 24 years by people who smiled at her in the grocery store that Danny had killed his wife, and that she'd never once believed it and had never once been able to prove it, and that being right had turned out to feel like nothing at all. Then she turned and looked at the man in the orange jumpsuit and said the only thing she had come there to say. "I cleaned your stone. Twice a year, for 24 years, on my knees. I brought a towel." She sat down. Rosalind Kessler was in the seat beside her, and she reached over and took Eleanor Whitcomb's hand, and that was the first time those 2 women had touched since a receiving line under a leaking tent on July 18, 1992. They had spent 24 years 2 miles apart, arranging their grief around each other like traffic. Neither of them let go for the rest of the hearing. Danny and Marie Whitcomb were buried together in Tamarack Bend on August 12, 2016, in the Kessler family plot, at Rosalind's insistence. She stood up in front of 90 people and said she'd been wrong out loud for 24 years, and she was going to be right out loud now, and that this boy had died for her daughter and would be buried with her. Eleanor Whitcomb was asked to pick the stone. She picked one wide enough for 2 names and had the mason carve underneath them in small letters. She came back. The memorial at the Camas Ridge trailhead was harder. The county wanted to remove the whole plate. Eleanor asked them not to. She said the 2 names on it were the only reason her son had been remembered at all, in the years when the town thought he was a monster, and she wasn't going to throw away 24 years of somebody's flowers. So on a Saturday in September of 2016, a monument mason drove up 18 miles of Forest Service Road with a pneumatic tool and, in front of about 60 people, ground the name Wendell Arliss off the brass and refinished the surface flat. There's a blank space there now. They left it blank on purpose. Underneath, they added 1 line. Found June 9th, 2016. Eleanor Whitcomb, at 78, drove up there afterward with a jug of water and a rag and a folded towel and knelt down and cleaned 2 stones instead of 3. And later she told a reporter that she'd expected to feel triumphant, and instead she mostly felt tired and a little bit robbed because for 24 years she'd been giving something to a man who had taken everything from her, and there was no getting those visits back. That is the part nobody prepares you for, not the grief. The grief you expect. Nobody prepares you for finding out you mourned the man who did it. There's a photograph on Eleanor Whitcomb's refrigerator now, in a magnetic frame her granddaughter gave her. It isn't the wedding portrait. It's frame 24, the one Junie Alcott dated to the evening of September 8, 1992. Sun low, smoke haze, 4 days left. In it, Marie Whitcomb is looking up through binoculars at something in the sky, and Danny is not looking at the sky at all. He's looking at his wife, looking at the sky, with his mouth open a little, the way he did. They are the accidental subjects of a picture a 19-year-old took of his friends in a chow line, a picture that sat undeveloped in a pill bottle for 22 years, then in a cardboard box on a folding table in a driveway in Nampa, Idaho. Priced at $11 for the whole lot. If Terrell Boyce hadn't turned slightly to his left, if his mother had thrown out the footlocker, If a man in Boise hadn't bothered developing film, he expected to be blank. If a retired cartographer hadn't worked the edges of the frame instead of the center. If an 81-year-old timekeeper had ever, once, cleaned out her filing cabinet. Any one of those, and Danny and Mari Whitcomb are still under 2 meters of rock below Coffin Rock. And a good man's name is still a curse in his own hometown. And an old man in Oregon is still shoveling widows' walks for free. It came down to one small detail. It always does. We tell ourselves that the truth wants to come out, that it claws its way up on its own, that it's only a matter of time. That isn't quite right. The truth doesn't want anything. It just sits there, patient and unbothered, in a pill bottle, in a filing cabinet, under a rock, waiting for somebody to look. What comes out on its own is the story, the easy story, the one about the man with the temper and the chainsaw. That story built itself in a hardware store in about 4 months and stood for 24 years, and it was wrong from the first day. But here is what those 2 young people did with the 400 yards they had. He stood on a road with nothing in his hands so she could run. And she ran. She was clear. She was safe. She was gone. And then she turned around and came back up that road for him, knowing exactly what was waiting. 24 years of rumor could not touch that. 2 meters of rock could not bury it. A man who spent his whole life making himself unfindable could not make it disappear. Some people vanish because someone made them vanish. But what they were in the last minutes of their lives doesn't vanish with them. It waits in an old photograph, in a folded towel, in a mother on her knees in the dirt until somebody finally looks. In the end, love proved stronger than the darkness. It usually takes longer than it should, but it holds.